Welcome to the 775 Alive podcast. I am Crystal Newton.
And I'm Scott Gavorski. So what are we chatting about today?
We are talking about tariffs.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. And you can probably guess why.
Well, lay it on me. First, before she does, when she's cracking about this, I want to point out that we are still filming in Elko. But I thought it'd be good for people to see a little bit of where you're from.
Yes.
So we have this wonderful picture here of downtown Winnemucca over in Humboldt County. So Jenny Lynn, thank you very much for the photograph. This is, like I said, downtown Winnemucca. In the background is Winnemucca Mountain. Some of you who aren't from the West might see the big W on the side of the mountain. That's something that really started in the 1920s out here as a way for pilots to identify where they were. And then it sort of evolved into a point of civic pride. Usually the local high schools sort of maintain them. It's really a unique aspect of I think, Western life.
Yeah.
You see them.
Winnemucca was a crossing for the pioneers.
Oh, yeah.
The Humboldt River kind of cuts through Winnemucca, and that's how the whole town started. And if you go there today, especially this area, it still looks just like you would think it would look from 100 years ago,
Right.
which is kind of the charm of Winnemucca, I think.
Right. It's actually one of our more garden cities. And
Yeah, I think we have about 12,000 people.
Yeah.
To, is Elko around 50?
Well, yeah. So I think you guys might be a little less than 12,000, maybe 10,000. But Elko, the city of Elko, and this is one thing I probably should have specified. There's a city of Elko located in Elko County. City of Elko is about 22,000, but our neighboring community of Spring Creek, just over the ridge, adds about another 18,000 to that. So we're in that 45,000 category.
Getting there.
Yeah, we're good size.
Big city.
So back to tariffs.
Still a ways from Costco, though.
Still a ways from a Costco. This is one of the big things been going here. We'll have to have another discussion about that, how companies might see rural Nevada communities. But yeah. So anyway, tariffs.
So I have been hearing a lot in the news media about tariffs, and it's either one side that's saying it's the worst thing in the world, it's going to crash the economy, it's going to exaggerate inflation, and the other side's like, it's about time.
Mm-hmm.
We've been needing to do this in forever. And so Scott and I were like, let's put our thinking caps on. Let's see if we can get to the bottom of this. And I think we have come to a lot of angles on this subject that make sense from both sides.
Right.
And so tariffs are one of those things where it's very dependent on the circumstances of the economy, of how well the globe's getting along. There's a lot of things that play into whether or not a tariff's a good thing or a bad thing. And we can actually point to a few places in American history where we've seen tariffs play out.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's start with basics.
Yeah.
Right. What is a tariff?
Tariff is a tax that crosses an international border.
Mm-hmm.
That is the very basic part of it. It's a tax, just like any other tax.
Mm-hmm.
The only difference is, again, it crosses that international border. Every other tax is usually within the domestic country border.
Although I would argue, and this is one of the things I think we're going to talk about a little bit better or a little later, that actually does impact Nevada, is that it doesn't have to be an international border, but any type of jurisdictional border, I would say.
Yeah.
And I bring that up in part because where tariffs really start appearing in American history is under the period of the Articles of Confederation, which was the first government before the Constitution. So we're talking 1780s, the Revolutionary War is over, and the 13 states, united so they might be, start throwing tariffs on each other.
Yeah.
Right. And this is one of the things that leads to the Constitutional Convention. And, Section 1, Article 10 of the Constitution very specifically says, states cannot put tariffs on the proceeds from other states.
Yeah.
Right. So bearing that in mind, let's talk a little bit, because tariffs are something that appear in a lot of different ways and for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, I'd actually like to go back to what you just said.
Oh, okay. Well, go ahead.
The very beginning. So
as a historian, I'm not used to be telling, can you say that again?
Yeah, we're going to go back, because the very first tariff in the United States came very shortly after we began the country. And I don't think most people understand this. It's intuitive once you hear it. But we didn't have an income tax for a very long time in this country. Mm-hmm. So if the federal government wanted to raise funds, what they did was they used tariffs. And that was the primary mode that the tariff was used, was to generate revenue. Mm-hmm. And then we see a little bit later in our development in the 1920s, you start to see tariffs being used as a tool to protect brand new industries. Mm-hmm. And then a little later, you see tariffs being used as a leveraging tool to try to get other countries to do what we want. Right. And so there's kind of an iteration of how tariffs are used and what we've used them for in different periods during our country.
Yeah.
And you look like you're about to disagree with me. I love.
I'm going to disagree with
We're
you
about to learn something, folks.
On the timeline, because I do think you're absolutely right. There are tariffs that are designed to raise revenue. We tend to call these custom duties, but they're not much different. There are tariffs that are protectionist, right? Which I think actually well precede the 1920s in the U.S. I'll get to that in a minute. Then there's these leveraging tariffs. I would actually add there's a fourth category, which I'm calling regulatory tariffs, which maybe we could talk about at the end, because I think this is the one that's really escaping a lot of attention on these international sites because it is a domestic tariff.
Now, by regulatory, you mean targeted to specific items, specific industries?
Yes. Well, no, I'm talking about it more in a sense of tariffs that are designed to achieve specific sort of policy regulations, right?
Okay.
So for example, tariffs such as in California that we saw recently, saying that all pork sold in California must be humanely raised, wherever it is in the country. So if somebody from Iowa, say, refuses to follow that, they can't sell their pork in California. So they inherit the increased cost for a regulatory policy goal in California, but that functions effectively as a tariff, I would argue. So we could talk about that because there's actually a Nevada example. I think that might be good to hit towards the end of the show. But
well, I think most famously, using the California example again, they did that with gas-powered vehicles. Isn't there a certain year where you can no longer buy gas-powered vehicles?
Well, but that's different. So you're selling people you can't have you can't own a gas-powered vehicle in California, which in my mind is no different than saying you can't sell. I don't know. Well, if you don't mind me saying, you have a cannabis industry, and there's a lot of states where you can't sell cannabis. That's not a tariff because there's either you can sell it or you can't sell it, but there's no tax inherited. On the pork side, there is in effect a tax that's born from outside the country for that pork that comes across that regulatory boundary into the state. I think that. Can I give you a better example from Nevada? I think this is appropriate. Okay. So we've had, like the rest of the country, we've seen the explosion of egg prices, right? And a lot of this has to do with the culling of herds or flocks, your chickens, culling of flocks, and related to the bird flu. But one of the problems that happened is our last legislature in 2023 passed a law that all eggs sold in Nevada must come from cage-free, facilities.
Seems nice enough.
It seems nice enough, but one of the things that did is once egg prices went up, it limited where grocers and whatnot in Nevada could actually buy their eggs from. So it became a de facto tariff that increased the price of eggs because of this regulatory requirement. They couldn't go to, say, a traditional industrial egg farm and get the eggs. And one of the things that I think that shows in the legislature, this became so important that one of the first bills they passed, AB171, granted the agriculture secretary the ability to declare an emergency and declare that law null and void.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's a good example of what I'm talking about with these regulatory tariffs that are designed to handle a specific policy or guarantee that a product meets certain specifications. The infant feed crisis in 2022.
Yep.
Right, where we couldn't buy infant formula from Europe because of it. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about regulatory tariffs. Not what Trump's talking about and what we should get back to. But I think it's important to throw this in that tariffs come in very weird ways.
Well, it's really important when it comes to understanding it's going to sound silly, the character of a tariff, and really what it is. It's there's a free market where everything flows everywhere, and then you have stop gaps where you put in and you start to mold a market in the direction that you want it to go. And that's basically what a tariff is. It's a leveraging instrument that allows you to move the free market in the direction that you want it to go. Hopefully. Right. Now you can overcorrect, you can go a lot of wrong directions with the tariff, which is why you hear a lot of people really upset, nervous about our economy, the future. Some people are talking about, this is going to put us into recession. The tariff is a very strong leveraging instrument. So basically we're using it to move around that free market, but you move it too little or too much, you can end up in a problem.
Yeah, I would say, though, that's a very Trumpian definition of tariffs. Yeah. So pat yourself on the back for that if you want. No, I think that's right. But you're identifying one tariff in the terms of a tariff as a leveraging tool to enforce a certain viewpoint. It doesn't necessarily have to be a free market. Right. But I think that is right. So, example, using Trump, I mean, some of the early tariffs, the feeling was the threat of tariffs were aimed at getting Mexico, for instance, to deploy troops around the border.
Yep.
So that's leveraging in the sense of a negotiation tool.
Yes.
Right. But there's also the fact that what I think you're identifying is this idea that tariffs can be used in a productive manner to sort of create an ideal trading situation.
Mm-hmm.
Right. How much do you think that's playing into Trump's tariff?
Pretty close to 100%.
Okay.
Yeah. And the reason I say that is we had a free trade agreement from 1934 up until 2018 when Trump took office.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why we had this open period where we were shipping exports out and not charging a tariff was because we wanted more people to buy our goods.
Mm-hmm.
Now we become overextended.
Mm-hmm.
We have a very high debt compared to our income.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that situation, we are no longer in the affording position where we can take a loss spreading our product across the globe.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, we need to stop sending it out for free,
Mm-hmm.
and we need to start rebuilding our center.
Mm-hmm.
And that'll help close that debt ratio that we have.
Mm-hmm.
But it's more along the lines of this is the development of our economy. We're at this place where we've overextended ourselves to the free trade.
Mm-hmm.
And the way we stop that and rein it back is by implementing a tariff.
Mm.
And the reason I say it's 100% Trump's intent is because he's announced trillions of dollars of spending and investment that's coming in to revitalize that manufacturing. So we've got to build up our domestic and close down our international activities. We're kind of, it's like when the stock prices go up and down.
Mm-hmm.
If you go up too far for too long, you have to have a correction.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens during that correction is you actually fill in the base. So those numbers are artificial numbers until they settle down to the actual number.
That's right.
And then they can build again.
Right.
So these tariffs right now are really Trump's attempt to help bring up our actual balance sheets to match our GDP.
Okay, I think I see where you're going. Although one of the things I would point out, from my view, is this idea that tariffs as protective to allow industry to develop. Right, you're talking about this in terms of recreating a manufacturing section, and I think you're right. I can see where that might be one end goal of Trump's policies.
Yeah.
And actually, in tariffs, despite the supposed free trade period we've had since '34. The U.S. does have tariffs on goods. This is one of the reasons a lot of, for instance, Japanese automakers have plants in the U.S. is they're avoiding the tariffs.
Yeah.
Right. They can set up, Toyota can set up a plant in Tennessee and not have to have a tariff on a Toyota truck that if it shipped it out of Kyoto or something, it would have. But I think what's more interesting is the fact that, and I'll point out, tariffs are not an American invention. Right. Although there's this weird idea.
It's not even an American word.
It's not even an American word. It's actually Arabic that comes across the Renaissance, right?
And do you know what it means in Arabic?
It's just like a bill of goods or something, right?
Actually, it means to recognize.
Oh, huh.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Sorry. We both studied Arabic as undergraduates in college, but I have to look that up. Tariffs certainly existed before the United States, right? That the European usage of the word is really from the 16th century in England. We looked this up in the Oxford English Dictionary the other day when we were arguing over the meaning of the word.
Well, and think about it too. It's an international boundary crossing thing. So when the Europeans were trading, the word would have come from either the Arabs or the Chinese, or it would have come from there because that's the only place those numbers existed.
But where it comes, I think how it was used before the 1790s really was in a sense that tariffs were used as part of mercantilist policy. And mercantilism was something that we heard closely associated with Trump's economic policies in his first term. And this was sort of the dominant economic policy of Europe in the 16th and 17th and up into the 18th centuries. The idea that economics represents sort of a limited pie. There's only so much bullion available in the world. And that if your country wanted to get stronger, it had to capture a larger share of bullion in another country.
Yeah.
And how you do that outside the obvious taking, bullion producing regions, would be that you can control that trade coming across your border.
Yeah.
Right. So if the British keep red wine from France coming across their border, they would do stuff like that would mean less British bullion and wealth going across the border to France, but it also means France was losing that wealth that it could gain from selling the wine.
Yeah.
So that would shift this sort of economic thing into a gear. And then if you got really desperate, you either smuggled the wine into Britain or turn to your good allies, the Portuguese, and start drinking sherry or Madeira, or one of those sweet wines from the Portuguese islands, right? But seriously, that's why these become part of British culture is they can't buy French wines. But what the U.S. do...
I have a quick question.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So aside from those reasons, I was also thinking those merchants were probably paid on some kind of a commission. And the tariff might have been one way that the crown could have split off a commission. Because I'm thinking too, like there's plenty of instances where, say, Spain sent a ship over to South America to get gold, and then the ship never returns.
Right.
I think we all know.
Right.
Like, what's the incentive to return any of your booty if you're not going to get a sizable share? Like, do you think tariffs were used in that way as well, so they could pay those merchants?
Well, I think there's... I'm
sorry.
No, because I think you're bringing up something very interesting about tariffs generally. Then I'll answer the question, right? A specific historical question. The question would be, or the issue you raise is that tariffs aren't necessarily one-sided. I mean, we're talking about different types of tariffs, but a tariff can actually do multiple things.
Yes.
And we're seeing that now in some of the discussion around Trump's tariffs, where people are like, well,
especially now,
we're gonna put these tariffs on goods, and there's people out there. This is going to let us get rid of the income tax because we're going to replace government revenue with these tariffs. That I would argue was one of the goals of tariffs in the 19th century.
Like the government would ever give up a tax.
Well, that is certainly true, but I'm not really sure. I mean, the whole reason we went to an income tax, and most countries went to some form of income tax, was exactly that tariffs weren't raising enough money for the more services that were being demanded by the government, right? Now, back to your specific example, to what extent is this going to, or to what extent do they serve the pay to merchants? The answer is no, because those ships are either owned directly by the government, going back to Spain, or in the British and Dutch cases, what we're starting to see at this time is a lot of those ships that might be carrying that bullion were ran by, this is really where joint stock companies come from in the modern terms. A bunch of people get together to fund a ship. And then the idea they might get a commission from the king to bring back bullion, right? But their real wealth is then bringing back these other goods, right? And selling them for huge profits, right? That's where the connection is. So it's not paying the merchants, I think, or the merchants paying the king. There's other ways to do that. But these tariffs can be used to raise revenue in certain cases. For instance, one of the reasons the tariff, and I think going back, you talked about the tariff early in the American history, right? And I think you're talking about the tariff of 1789, which is set in place right when the Constitution goes into effect, right?
And if I remember right, and I got to get this because he's the historian, the French funded the Revolutionary War, and the tariff was to pay back the French.
Well, in part, right? I mean, the point was, yeah, no, you did good. The problem that the young country faces, and another reason outside of this infighting among the colonies on their own tariffs, was the fact that the Continental Congress under the Articles of Confederation had no taxing power and had huge debts from the Revolutionary War. And so figuring out how to pay those debts is one of the driving forces, because you don't pay France back, or Spain or one of these other creditor countries, they're going to come invade you, was the fear. Totally skipping the point, 1789, the French are bankrupt because of the money they lent the Americans and are about to undergo their own revolution. But that's another story. But I think there is an interesting dimension to this, because that was only part of the reason for that tariff. And they have other ways to pay back the French. So the large land sales of the Western territories, right? The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the Land Ordinance of 1785. All these are designed to sell off these Western lands that now belong to the Congress because they've been surrendered by Britain during the war. And the proceeds from those lands are being used to pay off the revolutionary debts as well. But you have Alexander Hamilton, right? Of the musical fame, right? He, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, is really pushing this idea that America should be engaged almost in these mercantilistic policies, but the problem is they don't have industry.
Yeah.
Right. So these tariffs become a way not only for the government to raise revenue, right? And one of the things is that it keeps the states from collecting that revenue by tariffing each other, but allows the federal government, now embodied in the Congress as we know it today, to collect that revenue coming into the country.
Yeah.
Right. So it is a centralization, but it also becomes embedded as a way in Hamilton's mind, to protect American industry and allow it to develop without having outside countries come in.
Yeah.
And I think this really becomes the hallmark of American use of tariffs, right? Going forward, and why so many people sort of point to the United States as starting the whole tariff problem, is they really do play a protectionist role.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which raises the question, if you are trying to spark manufacturing, which Trump seems to be to do, are these tariffs that are going to be imposed, are they going to be these protective tariffs like we've seen so often in American history? Or are they going to be something else?
That remains to be seen.
That does remain to be seen. And I will point out, and I don't want to, we don't have to spend so much time on this, but this is not the first time tariffs have caused major political divisions.
I'm going to bring up Smoot-Hawley.
No, we're not quite to Smoot-Hawley. Smoot-Hawley we need to talk about. I'm actually thinking of an earlier thing known as the Tariff of Abominations, or the Abominable Tariff.
The Abominable Tariff.
So this going back to Andrew Jackson's first term. And one of the things that's been interesting watching Trump here over the last 9-10 years, really since he announced for presidency in 2015, is Andrew Jackson, somebody else he's talked about extensively. Mm-hmm. And Andrew Jackson, Congress passes.
He oversaw Reconstruction, didn't he?
No, you're thinking Andrew Johnson.
Oh.
This is Andrew Jackson, right? Who's our first what's called non-notable president. He comes from the West, when the West was like Tennessee. But he comes from the West. He's the first president that has no direct experience of the Revolutionary War. He's born after the Revolution.
Okay.
Right. All the presidents before had either been participants in the Revolution, or John Quincy Adams, who is the president directly before Jackson, is, he's a teenager when his father's in the revolutionary governments and serving as ambassador to London in the 1780s. So he's part of that world, but Jackson has no knowledge of this. So, but one of the things that happens is Congress, which at this time is sort of dominated by Northeastern manufacturing,
right,
interest, wants to introduce a new tariff to protect this burgeoning New England industrial stuff. The South bitterly opposes this, because the South at this time, and this is really the beginning of the King Cotton period, supposedly of the South, when cotton becomes the dominant industry in the South after 1820, the South is buying manufactured goods predominantly from England in trade for this cotton, right?
Right.
The conflict over this gets so bitter, right? So the tariff
over the coal industry? Or which industry?
Cotton. No, it's
Northeast.
Over manufacturing. It's manufacturing. So manufactured goods manufactured in England, whether it be mechanical parts, clothing, that type of stuff, if they're coming in the U.S., are going to be subject to a tariff, because New England industry wants to build its internal markets.
Okay.
The South, who is trading heavily with England, cotton for basically these manufactured goods, sees this as it's going to make stuff too expensive for them. It's going to make them subject to these, as they see it, these sort of rich bourgeoisie up in the Northeast. But this debate gets so bitter that by 1832, South Carolina decides to try to secede from the Union over the tariffs. And when they threaten to do this, Andrew Jackson, who, by the way, is himself a Southerner, right, actually threatens to use military force to keep him in the Union, right? And South Carolina backs down.
Do you remember the time period was for that?
1832.
1832.
Yeah, this is huge, and it's the exact same situation that plays out almost 30 years later, except this time South Carolina decides to secede, thinking Abraham Lincoln is not going to use military force because they don't see him as strong of a ruler as Jackson, and Lincoln makes a choice too, and we get to the Civil War, right? Okay. So these tariffs have caused some deep divisions, and in fact,
Did you draw a direct line between the abominable tariffs in the 1830s and the Civil War?
Oh, I think there's a direct thing. That's what I was going to say.
Of it?
One of the interesting, it's an example where tariffs mix with other issues to create extreme political discontent, which I think is
a mirror to today.
A mirror to today. That was largely my point. There is a connection though, because one of the interesting things, and In no way, shape, or form am I saying we should model anything on the Confederacy. But from an academic standpoint, the Confederacy Constitution that gets passed in 1861 is a fascinating document, in part because how it deviates or diverges from the American Constitution that we know today is a whole range of issues that were dominant in the early 19th century, including tariffs, right? So it has different language about international tariffs and how they can be imposed. And that is the Confederacy in 1861, looking back on the 1832 crisis and figuring out there's a better way to do this so we don't become subject to a regional power.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, it's a fascinating example, I think, of where some of this tariff stuff can go really, really bizarre.
Yeah, and I feel like it is important to bring up several instances of tariffs in this country just because, like at the beginning, what I was saying, tariffs are really dependent on the circumstance, the way they're used, how they're used. And more we're finding there's an emotional component to it as well. And I'm not sure if it's the emotions cause the tariff or the tariff cause the emotions, but it seems to be that they coincide quite a bit. There's usually, say like with Smoot-Hawley, there was a whole bunch of actions taken by the government that preceded those tariffs. And it kind of felt like by the time they came around to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, they were already completely turned around emotionally, didn't quite know how to work on the problem, and they were kind of in a panic situation.
Well, yeah, and let's break this down, because Smoot-Hawley is probably the one that most of you have heard about discussion in terms of tariffs. And the time period we're talking about this is the Great Depression.
Yes.
Right. So,
well, arguably it was one of the major factors that contributed to the Great Depression.
Some people argue. Now, the Depression, the Smoot-Hawley tariff isn't passed until 1930. So, the Great Depression has already happened. The stock market crash of Black Friday of 1929, all that's already happened. So we're already in the Depression. I think part of the argument is that we have a situation where governments are panicking. Hoover, who's the president, the Republican president at the time, actually opposes the Smoot-Hawley tariffs.
Yep.
Yeah, he doesn't see him as useful.
Hoover actually thinks it'll work itself out.
Right.
He says, leave it alone. And Congress says, we're going to do something.
Right. So Congress passes the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which puts huge tariffs on anything. And again, these are tariffs not in the sense of generating revenue, but in increasing domestic industry, protecting domestic industry. But what the Smoot-Hawley tariffs end up doing is it sparks a trade war as other countries start doing the same. They desperately want to protect their domestic industries, with the idea being if they protect the industries, by the time Smoot-Hawley goes into place, we're not seeing, 1932 is really the depth of the Depression in the U.S., where we start seeing unemployment hitting 25%, right, which is not good. But Smoot-Hawley, they're already seeing high unemployment, so they're desperately looking for ways to get factory employment up. Stopping foreign competition seems to be the way to go. And I think a lot of scholars, particularly those who don't have a strong economic background, see the Smoot-Hawley tariffs as sort of exasperating the Great Depression. It makes it worse.
Yeah. I think it's really, there's a lot of parallels between the 1920s going into the 30s and what we're experiencing right now. I think it's important to understand that through the 20s, there was a number of things happening, starting with the Federal Reserve requiring less reserves at banks. I think they dropped it down to 3%. So banks only had to hold 3% of the value of their accounts. And you had margin trading in the stock market that caused a lot of loss to happen. Essentially, though, you see, as that market starts crashing, you see an erosion of assets. And I think that's really important to say and point out, because as we sit right now, we are a cash poor country. We're not as liquid, but the amount of assets we have, we're actually under leveraged financially.
Right.
And so slapping a tariff on after the 1920s, what happened when we had a huge erosion of assets? It just could not sustain. It couldn't hold. Fast forward to today, we have plenty of assets, and worldwide, the US dollar is backing almost everything. So in terms of being able to weather the storm of a tariff, we're in a much better position. And that's my opinion, but there's a huge difference between those two instances,
well,
I think.
And I think you're absolutely right, because one of the things you did touch on an important issue, and it sort of goes back to your point about emotional reasoning that impacts society sometimes. Tariffs are no policy decision is ever 100% isolated from everything else. It's not unique. right? In the sense that it's the only thing people are concerned about. There's other issues. There's always other issues at play. So, even going back to the abominable tariff of 1828, one of the issues that gets this so heated is you're already starting to see sort of regional tensions grow as the antebellum cotton industry develops and some other issues.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, I think a lot of economic historians now sort of look at the Smoot-Hawley tariffs and say, look, all these other issues, the assets, the lack of federal bank reserves that caused banks to, or required federal reserves that caused the bank to crash, the breakdown of international trade. Again, one of the problems of the Great Depression, there's an overproduction of agricultural goods, right, which causes agricultural prices, which leads to the horrific images that left a lot of people in depression of, people were starving in the streets and the government's going out destroying crops and killing it, slaughtering animals.
Yeah.
Right. In an desperate effort to raise agricultural prices under the belief if agricultural prices go up, they'll start buying stuff from factories and that puts factory workers. All this is going on that has nothing to do with the tariffs. If the tariffs don't go into place, all this other stuff is continuing. And I think there's a lot of economists and economic historians now that would say the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, they certainly didn't help the situation at all.
Yeah.
But they're struggling to find what would have prevented the drop off that they were already seeing. Right. The truth is that the Great Depression was probably a unique enough event with so many overlapping causes. The tariffs just, they in and of themselves didn't cause anything. At worst, they might have been a symptom.
Yeah. And there's I think it's important to point out that the study of economics it's a different study and a different discipline than, say, medicine or, let's see, what's a better example? Let's look at the law.
Okay.
So when you go into a courtroom and you argue a case, you use precedents. The law is built off precedents. In fact, you can't really go in and argue something that's unprecedented because the court won't accept it. It only uses what's been accepted in the past. That's precedents. Economists try to do this, but I think it really fails. And I think it's important for people to understand that when it comes to economy, it's not an exact science. And it can be wildly different depending, again, we're talking about emotions. Emotions come into it. And especially when it comes to tariffs. And I think in the 1920s and 30s, probably insulting a lot of the world. Just a little bit.
I'm not really sure it was so much insulting because everybody's in a panic.
Well, right now, we've even seen it right now. It's like we saw a retaliatory tariff from France that was kind of funny to me because as soon as we put out tariffs, they're like 200% on champagne. It just seemed random. You're just like, fine then.
Well, it isn't random. And the France issue might be an interesting one to come back to in a minute because how they're trying to address that. But
this wine.
Well, yeah, and what we're talking about is they put this on tariff. They put the tariff on champagne, but France for probably 10 or 15 years has been in a wine glut. Right, probably because of the expansion of cheaper wines that are very good quality cheaper wines from other parts of the world. And they've even been talking about doing stuff like the French government or encouraging companies to buy up wine to investigate turning into biofuels and stuff like that in an effort to do something here. That being said, I think what you really touched on there when economics, and this is really any field, right? But economics in particular, you also have the fact that whatever lessons you think you've learned might shift if the economy under it shifts. And so one of the reasons I think Smoot-Hawley becomes so demonized, particularly after the Second World War, is you already have a perception emerging among leading economists. And John Maynard Keynes is the key. Keynesian economics. You probably heard that here in the 2000s.
Yeah.
Right. He's actually an economist who serves as part of the staff members of the negotiation of the Versailles Treaty in 1919 after the First World War. And of course, France famously, in an effort to both punish Germany and to cripple Germany's economy, imposes absolutely heinous reparations payments. Absolutely heinous payments. I mean, this was a very clear effort by Georges Clemenceau to cripple Germany's industry, and Keynes sees this in a book called The Economic Consequences of Peace. He writes, "This is madness," right?
Yeah.
But his reasoning for this is that European economies at this point are already so interconnected and interdependent on each other. You try to punish Germany, you're going to bring everybody down. And he also was president. And it's like, and when you do that, starving people don't behave rationally, right?
This is true.
And so when the Depression happens, Keynes comes back and sort of propounds his policy. The way you solve these depressions is you make sure that the consumer has money to buy goods, and that keeps the factory workers employed. So economic stimulus. Before this, governments tried desperately not to spend more than they brought in. Keynes is one who refuses that. Right. Well, Keynes' argument is that in times of economic crisis, you've got to keep consumer spending up. So that's where we get stuff like the stimulus checks we saw with COVID and other stuff. The problem with this is that we might be shifting out of this in some ways with this economic model. I don't think Keynes is necessarily wrong. And Paul Krugman, the Nobel-winning economist who writes for the New York Times, and I will say I have a lot of admiration for the Krugman's work that he won the Nobel Prize from. It's very done. It's political commentary.
It is funny. We're both fans of him 20 years ago.
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't think it's 20 years, but Krugman famously said from 2008 after that recession, he kept saying, the key point of Keynesian economics is as long as you're paying somebody to shovel the dirt, it doesn't matter how many holes you dig, right? It's them taking I think people are starting to say, no, you don't just throw money at a problem, right? What you need to do is sort of direct that spending in a way that might actually then encourage industry.
Sure.
I'm not sure we've seen that, but I think this is something that's in the background of Trump's economic team, is that the U.S. can't, even as a reserve currency, just keep throwing problems at money at problems at the national that's creating the national debt.
Yeah.
We need to rebalance the equation.
Well, and I would also say, though, making declarative statements is kind of going to the heart of what I say the problem is here.
Mm-hmm.
There really is no precedence because an economy is not a rigid thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything is changing all the time. I guess my biggest takeaway for people would be you hear people making declarative statements about if a tariff's good or bad. Be very cautious.
Right.
There's just no way to make that statement. And it's always going to change. And if the economy was that predictable and that manipulatable, then you would be able to it would just be one group of people making money off of it because you could always predict where it's going. The fact that that doesn't happen shows you how unpredictable an economy is.
And I think there's also a dynamic in this unpredictability market as well, is that despite this belief that we don't have tariffs, we do, right? Most countries use tariffs. And this is something that hasn't really come out of Trump's discussion, is that these tariffs are being phrased as reciprocal tariffs. Mm-hmm. This isn't the U.S. going out and just looking for a way to punish countries. It really is saying, France, you have tariffs on American goods. And until you drop that tariff on our goods, we're going to put a similar tariff on your goods.
Yep.
Right. And I think that's an important part of this component, and understanding that, we have this weird situation where people arguing against tariffs as if other countries don't use them against the U.S.
Right.
And use them is probably the wrong term. And I think this is an important point to keep in mind. A lot of modern tariffs, particularly those that are used by the European Union, really date to mid-late 1970s or more recently. And they become from this protectionist standard, right? Of course, the European Union grows out of the common market, which very much like the 13 original colonies, one of its goals was to prevent tariff wars between the members, right?
Yeah.
But no problem with tariffs from outside.
I think I should also probably mention the effect that post-World War II had.
That's where I was going. So one of the things, if we look at European economic history, is that, Europe's destroyed after World War II, right? The continental countries, particularly France and Germany, and to a lesser extent Italy and Britain, embark on this massive period where they got to rebuild. I mean, housing stocks are shot, transportation networks are shot, agriculture has been destroyed, and both France and Germany, these are the 30-some years, roughly 30 years after the end of World War II, up to the oil crisis in the 1970s, are really seen as almost this economic miracle. Right. Yeah. So in France, they're called the 30 Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. In Germany, it's the Wunderwirtschaft, right? The economic wonder years, right? They have huge employment and whatnot. after 30 years, they have their economies built.
Yep.
Right. They've got stuff done, and an oil crisis hits, and all of a sudden, we start seeing the European economies starting to suffer. Right. So a lot of people like to point out that European unemployment in many cases is higher than American. That really only starts after these wonder years disappear.
What I'm thinking about, there's two things happening side by side post World War II up to the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
We gave them a bunch of money to rebuild. We financed the rebuilding, and we had no tariffs on our exports.
Right.
So not only did we give them money to rebuild, but we were sending our products without any tariff. When those two together led to the glorious years where it was free money and free products.
And there's also the Cold War to remember, right? Which one of the things you want to do, the United States has a very conscious policy that free trade is the way of the future, not these centralized directed economies that the Soviet Union's using.
Try to pull economic power from that other opposing force.
And let's be clear, the U.S. benefited greatly.
Huge.
In the 1950s and early 60s from this trade, because nobody else is producing anything. I mean, one of the ironies, you're a big fan of looking at GDP numbers, but one of the things is in the 1950s, the American share of the global GDP was over 50%. I mean, that's just astounding. No other countries had that, but that's because everybody else bombed themselves to oblivion, or we helped them bomb themselves to oblivion, however you want to do that. We're back down to about 21%, which interestingly was about where the U.S. was at the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Right. So this wasn't the U.S. being ripped off then. The question is these tariffs come in a way to protect these in many ways, these European industries from this encroaching economic crisis where they can't see themselves compete. And a lot of them are aimed against American goods, right? And these are the tariffs that really seem to have Trump bothered.
Yeah.
Right, because they've gone on for so long. And he argues that in some ways what these tariffs are doing are so protecting the industry in these countries, they've become unproductive and uncompetitive, right? That they're just used to, as he would say, not that I'm saying this, but as Trump would say, ripping off the U.S. constantly, right? So, and Trump wants to restore that balance, which could help the United States, right? Again, this fear that this is going to drive up consumer prices, which gets us into the Keynesian dimension of this, but also sort of restore eventually, and that's what a lot of people have. Are these strictly sort of almost a mercantilistic idea where it's about building up America over everybody else, or is this as you described it, sort of a developmental sort of use of tariffs to do stuff such as restore a period of free trade by resetting the boundaries?
Yeah, I'm just going to build off that conversation we're having of those 30 great years of Reconstruction in Europe. We were
small R Reconstruction for my American historian friends.
So we were in this position where we were financing everything. And eventually, at one point, we started to add a debt load that was unsustainable. So when I look at the tariffs, I see that as more of correcting. We've gotten over our skis, I said earlier in the podcast. And there's a number of things we can do to get that back under control. But essentially, the rest of the world's caught up. They're on their feet. They're doing well to the point of competing with us. And in the period of time it took us to get from there to here, we amassed a huge debt. So really, it's more of it's an exercise in we went too far. We got to pull back a little, and all those things go into it. We had all these tariffs from everywhere else, but no reciprocal tariffs, and we got to catch up with that now. We really can't be spending money the way that we used to, and we've really got to redevelop our own domestic manufacturing.
And that's I think that's a tension I think we've seen throughout American history, because we talked about tariffs going back to Alexander Hamilton being protectionist, right?
I feel like you should break out in a song every time you say it.
Yeah, I know, dance around. But the a key part of that is there's a lot of people now who argue, the American tariffs weren't really needed in the 19th century. American industry was going to develop because it is a growing country. They have the resources, they have the assets. And I think that's part of the dynamic now is that, is that the case? Do we need these tariffs? Not to mention what this does for a motto of Keynesian economics that sort of holds, if you raise prices and encourage people not to spend on consumer goods, that's ultimately bad for your economy, which gets into the whole question, is there a value in cheap consumer goods?
It really, I did a little bit of studying, and it wildly varies.
Uh-huh.
So one example of an industry sector that would never come back to America, we shouldn't even bother, is clothing. Because the ability for like Vietnam, Philippines, Taiwan, China to produce clothing at such a cheap rate, there's just no way we could do it. And it just comes down to how much we pay our people here. So
Right.
Here in America, we have benefits. They get a good hourly rate. After you add in all that, you don't have cheap clothing anymore.
Right.
So clothing's one example where it's absolutely not going to work for that sector. But there's several other ones. And the ones that this really impacts happen to be high ticket, high value items. So we're talking about things like lithium batteries and cars and just bigger items that are more substantial financially. And it would make more sense to bring them home because the labor rates don't necessarily impact the bottom line like they do the clothing.
Right.
So it's one of those things, like it's so nuanced and you have to take it case by case. And I really caution when people hear any kind of Monday morning quarterbacking on tariffs, because there's really no way to go back etch a sketch and redo it. Like what happens in the 1930s if Smoot-Hawley was never passed? Maybe something, maybe nothing. So I would caution against the Monday morning quarterbacking and definitely caution anyone who's definitive about what tariffs do and don't do. Yeah, it's a big deal.
It is a big deal. And, you know, again, any type of tariff or any type of policy decision is going to be structured by a whole range of issues. And there is no clear definitive answer to a lot of stuff.
And here's a good example. Let me ask you this. Let's say Trump didn't implement tariffs and we need to reinvigorate our manufacturing here at home and we need to stop our companies here from buying so much overseas. What do you do? Yeah,
well, that is the question.
Yeah,
right, and it butts up against a whole range of previous concerns. And I will point out one thing, just because it reoccurred me to again. I at least am not saying that a lot of the U.S. debt load is coming from manufacturing fleeing the U.S. A lot of it's coming from poor policy decisions. But again, there is an overlap. Right, clothing is a great example, and this might get us into the regulatory tariff.
We should do a whole segment on the debt.
Oh, we probably should. Yeah. But for instance, one of the things that's come out, I mean, you mentioned Philippines and Vietnam and these other countries for making clothing, but a large part of American foreign policy for years towards Africa has been encouraging African countries to sort of balance the extractive trade by writing in these provisions where they either have to buy the raw cotton for material or the clothing from the U.S., right? And this is something that just infuriates Africans. In many cases, they have native cotton and clothing industries. In some cases, they refer to American clothing. And I'm talking about these companies that do something, you buy something from us and we'll send a shirt over to an African country. You buy one shirt and we'll send one over. Well, these people have no problem clothing themselves.
Yeah.
And in fact, they some of the phrases they use are sort of like corpse clothes is what they call them, because they think they're throw-offs Americans don't want. But that's an interesting form of tariff where you're manipulating somebody else's industry to protect an industry here that probably does need to disappear.
Yeah.
Right. Or at least modify and go in another direction. Right. And that's just, and yeah, I bring this up because the other hot topic in the news is Doge and USAID. Guess what type of stuff USAID was doing? Was exactly these type of deals.
I wasn't going to bring it up, but yeah.
So yeah, I think this tariff issue is going to be with us for a while. We probably do need to revisit it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my favorite part of this podcast is talking about how the heck this relates back to the 775.
Oh yeah.
And I don't think you and I have some different ideas. I know you don't think the tariffs are going to uniquely impact Nevada. I think they will in an indirect way.
Okay. And I could say I just struggle to think that when we talk about Trump's types of tariffs, yes, it's probably going to raise some cost of goods. I think that's not, but I don't think what I'm saying by uniquely is I don't think in this. Nevada is necessarily going to be impacted any differently than Utah or Idaho, unless it gets to the point that foreign tourists disappear and stop coming to Vegas.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's always that possibility, but I don't.
Never going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not seeing foreign tourists disappear from Elko.
I'm always amazed people walking around 117-degree weather in Vegas. I'm like, who goes during the summer? Everyone that's not from there goes during the summer. It's the worst time to go.
But getting back to your point, that's not what you think.
No, I don't. And like I qualified it by saying it's going to be an indirect effect. But I think Nevada is going to see a huge revival in the rules because of this.
Okay.
The reason why, we've said the primary interest in the majority of the tariffs that Trump put out was to discourage companies domestically from buying overseas and encourage domestic production. Now, in tandem with that, Trump has announced several $1 trillion worth of investment from the private sector. And they're going to marry that, and they always do this with the federal government. Anytime they put forth a new prerogative, they want to encourage something new in the economy, they put out grants, or they put out a new line of funding or capital access to these new things. And I was reading, actually in the Elko Daily paper, I was reading about this, that Trump has spoken with some defense counsel that puts out loans for the mining industry. So building new infrastructure for the mining industry. Now, that all falls under this new direction that's been put in place by this tariff, or these sets of tariffs. So, to me, I think Nevada is going to see a lot more of those grants and spending and infrastructure development than states that don't have a mining presence.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, I can see the argument there.
Yeah.
We'll have to see how this develops. Although I don't get the impression that metals directly are sort of, except for steel. And the U.S. has had steel tariffs for years, right? I'm just...
There's a lot of upstart capital in a mine. So whether it's the lending the financial instrument, or whether it's material support, or you're going to see a lot more of it coming from the federal government. And to compare and contrast, the Biden administration, their prerogative was social spending. Their big thing they wheeled out was social infrastructure, which was essentially them taking regular physical infrastructure dollars and converting it to things like, speaking of USAID, we always like to say Elmo in Iraq.
Elmo in Iraq.
It's just it's the flashiest example, but the point was that you converted the spending from one sector of the economy to another. And I think you're going to see the same thing, and it starts with these tariffs. So the spending in the mining industry, there's going to be a lot more dollars available to start new mines or to improve mines. And that's all going to benefit rural areas. So I'm super excited that money's going to start to come our way again.
Right.
Yeah.
It's going to be something we want to watch. And, this might be one of those topics we do some follow-up podcasts.
I think we're going to have to watch it whether we want to or not.
Yeah, well, that's true. We might be a captive audience for this. So
I'm still waiting for a tariff rap song. Someone to come out.
Somebody will sometime or other, I bet. So anyway, I think that's a good thing. If you have any more questions about this or disagree with what we want to do, or happen to be an expert in tariffs that want to come on the show, let us know. Shoot us an email at info@775alive.com. And of course, you can go to 775alive.com and find all of our podcast episodes available there.
That's right. And we've got trivia. We've got lots of resources. If you want to get involved with anything in our state, if you want to find out more, Scott, you've got an amazing Substack. I cannot believe the resources that you put out for people to consume. So please go consume them.
Yep.
And until next time, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm Scott Gaborski.
I'm Kristen Newton.
See you around the 775.